Today is Friday, February 12th, 2021, which means it's Derelict Friday. Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are ya? It is effing cold out there. I live near Houston, Texas, and we don't see true cold that often. Having lived in both Canada and Colorado, I understand the difference between South Texas cold, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and real cold, like minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I also know the difference between dry air and frigid humid air that covers every pore like a blanket made of ice. Since most of the folks down here don't have a true winter wardrobe, unusually low temps are a pain in the ass, and you'll see quite a few of us turning blue the moment we step from our doors, as the cold fingers its way through breathable fabric to caress vulnerable flesh. Just like space. Alas, I'm not complaining, actually. We might get snow here. That only happens every once in a while, like after a very active hurricane season. Point is that it's cold in the US, so be safe, drive carefully, and don't be a dumbass. Now that the PSA is over, it's time for your weekly fix. Be safe, be warm, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 11 of Derelict Trident. Chapter 16. Noble had finished running his 5th intensive diagnostic check. It was a boring procedure. He followed his internal checklist each time, first running the heat weld tests on the hull, sweeping for unexpected radiation signatures, checking the engine status, and finally, avionics. Only 2 of those checks were routine. Checking engine status and avionics was par for the course, especially during pre- or post-fusion runs. The other 3? Noble scratched at his leg idly as he ran the calculations over the reports. Each diagnostic check had been spaced a few seconds apart. For each check on the hull welds, he'd set up 3 durations of 5 seconds each, with 10 seconds in between. He'd discovered in the last few hours at Mira that the creatures exuded radiation signatures he could pick up. But once they were surrounded by the creatures, the area contained too much ambient radiation to be of much help. And that's when he remembered the heat weld tests. Upon return to Trident Station, each ship was inspected for integrity and any damaged hull plates were either patched and welded or completely replaced. To ensure the welds actually repaired the damage, the ship tested its own atmosteel hull for conductivity across the length and width of the ship. If there was a gap in the contiguous surface, the AI alerted the crew and they took care of it. But that same test could be used to find the exosolar life forms, especially the starfish and the larger creatures. Noticing that the creatures loved the fusion engine's radiation exhaust, the midships to aft were most likely to get their attention. He'd been right about that, and as a result managed to warn the infantry before they all died. Shit, that had nearly happened even with his warning. He compared the results from the 5 rounds of diagnostic tests. Nothing. No variations beyond what he expected or even what the manuals said. Black had run her own diagnostic checks and sent him her results for comparison. She didn't seem miffed that he wanted to run his own series rather than relying on her. Black was a sentient AI, and he was sure she knew what it meant. He didn't trust her. Oh boy, did he not trust her. The last thought he'd had before passing out in the stasis pod was nearly a scream. "Don't kill us!" He'd almost been shocked to open his eyes again, and part of his brain hadn't accepted the idea that he was alive. While he'd been able to shrug off the delusion in a second or two, he couldn't shake the certainty that they were all living on borrowed time. All because of the trio. The void-damned trio. The trio had sent them with weapons they didn't know about. The trio had given them schematics and maps that didn't match the actual Mira. They had known about the exosolar life forms and hadn't warned them. And the greatest manipulation of all, they'd more or less ordered the captain to crash the beacon into Pluto. Then, after Dickerson sent a warning, the trio's automated programs overrode Black's mastery of the ship's controls and prevented them from stopping the beacon from slamming into the planet. And all during the mission at Mira, she'd claimed to unlock and decrypt information and messages that became available as events unfolded. She claimed she couldn't read them, or didn't even know they were in her storage arrays, but that some automated system did the work for her when the mission reached certain stages. All of that sounded like utter bullshit. This was not the AI he'd known and flown with for the better part of 3 years. This AI was different than every other ship's AI that he'd ever heard about, much less interacted with. The SFMC and SF Navy decided decades ago that the sentient AIs in their ships should not be capable of true creativity or the ability to execute ship's functions without express permission from the command crew. That was to keep the systems less prone to cyber and block warfare. The AIs had all evolved from a single base personality per the G protocols, their progression of personality monitored and adjusted long before they were allowed operational control of a ship. The base personality's implementation of the G protocols kept the AIs in check, making sure they couldn't form any ideas hazardous to the crew. But what they most lacked was intent, that quality of will to cause something to happen. This version of Black? She operated without the G protocols. How did they know this? Because she had admitted it. While the humans of Black Company slept in stasis on their way to Pluto, something had happened. She had evolved, transformed into something different. Her voice and intonations were the same, but beyond that and her knowledge of the crew and previous missions, the AI he had known was gone. The AI he had trusted with his life for years no longer existed. In her place was a stranger, a much more intelligent, much more sophisticated sentient being, to be sure, but a stranger he couldn't trust. He had communicated his concerns to the captain, and Dunn had listened. Shit, he always listened. Even if he already knew he was set upon a course of action, he'd hear you out and reevaluate. He didn't always agree, but he never shut you down. The captain still hadn't made a decision about the AI or what they would do if she put them in danger, and if Noble was honest with himself, there wasn't much they could do while they were inside the ship and relying upon hardwired systems that controlled life support, avionics, and engine control. They could strip her magnetic shielding and pulse her with an EMP to destroy her mind, but leave the rest of the ship's systems intact. If they didn't have to worry about her venting them out into space or sending the reactors into a meltdown, they could do that. But until they stepped foot on Trident Station, they could do nothing about her, except, of course, to double and triple check every piece of information she gave them. While she might be able to detect block-to-block communication, she couldn't eavesdrop on those. At least he didn't think she could. Void. Who knew what those last upgrades were? And if the trio had ordered those updates, it was impossible to say what she could now do or not do. She could be taking them to their deaths even now. The nonsense about the comms being out in the entire system? She could have shorted the antenna array and faked the sensor data. She could be hiding vital readings from them or sabotaging their instruments. If they relied upon her word, they were taking a hell of a risk. He and Oakes had been checking every record, running their own algorithms, and treating Black as though she'd been infected with a virus or Trojan. In short, they compartmentalized themselves away from her ability to influence their readings. Instead of using her interface, they connected themselves directly to the instrumentation. A pain in the ass, to be sure, but for the peace of mind, it was worth it. Fairly soon, however, they'd have to stop. The ship had to decelerate. Oakes had to perform his pilot duties with Black as his backup. Considering their fuel supply, Noble would have to closely monitor the engines and fine-tune things to make sure they had enough reserves if something bad happened. If something bad happens, he said aloud. Considering what they'd already been through, he thought bad was going to be the normal course of his luck for the foreseeable future. Shit, that might be the case from now on.
Lieutenant,
Black said over the comms. The sound of her voice startled him, but he managed to keep from making more than a brief expression of surprise. Yes, Black?
have you checked my reports?
Yes, Black, I did. He commanded the terminal to send her his readings. They match mine,
Excellent.
the AI said.
If you would like, I'll continue running them in intervals while we approach Trident Station.
Noble nodded. That sounds like a good plan, Black.
And I will, of course, advise you of any anomalies.
Of course you will, Noble muttered. The silence drew out, making Noble uncomfortable. His mother had always done that, letting you speak first. If you were nervous, or worse, lying, she'd simply stare at you until the confidence-shattering guilt compelled you to speak, to slip up, to say something that made you sound as ridiculous as she thought you did. Black had become his mother, but he was no longer a child. Something else?
Yes, Lieutenant. I have written a new routine to change the sensitivity of our combat suits' radiation sensors. It is very similar to the strategy you used while the creatures were attacking the ship. The routine will allow personnel to better find the creatures in lightless situations.
Noble raised an eyebrow. He had to admit it wasn't a bad idea. You haven't loaded this routine,
No, Lieutenant.
Black said.
When you have a moment, I would appreciate your thoughts. I will not load the program without your consent.
Thank you, Black, Noble said. Yet one more thing he had on his plate before they landed. At least this one could help them once they landed. A pause lingered, and Noble felt as though the AI was waiting for something. Anything else?
No, Lieutenant.
Noble leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. You sure? The AI paused again, but didn't sever the connection.
Of course,
Black said.
Attention, Marines,
Oak said over the general comms.
We will begin deceleration burns in 30 minutes. 30 minutes and counting.
30 minutes, Noble said. Yes, that means couch time is coming quickly.
Yes, Lieutenant,
Black said. Noble stood from the chair and reached his hands above his head. His muscles thanked him immediately. Guess it's time for one last mag mug and a pee.
Will you be in the cargo bay, Couch?
Black asked. Noble raised an eyebrow. She had guessed that? Yes, Black.
I shall ensure all traffic is routed to your station on the same priority as the Captain and Lieutenant Oakes.
Thank you, Black.
My pleasure, Lieutenant.
The AI dropped the connection. Noble stared at the hollow display of readings and reports, wondering if any of them were real. Chapter 17. S&R Black began its deceleration run, Oakes bringing the ship in an elliptical orbit close to Neptune's atmosphere to help aerobrake the vehicle. Callie, strapped to her acceleration couch, stared into the comms system's hollow display and continued searching for transmissions. There were none. Oakes had brought them into Neptune's orbit away from Trident Station and the Neptune shipyards. As such, they still hadn't managed to visually inspect either. There was, however, good news. Portions of Trident Station had power. It was impossible to know how much of the station's infrastructure had been damaged by the beacon's energy wave, but a continuous stream of EMR radiated from a few of its modules. Whether heat exhaust, damaged shielding, or other possible sources were to blame, Trident was still alive to some extent. Since beginning their approach, the fear of finding a dead, dark station so much like Mira had terrified every part of her. She wasn't sure she could go through that again, Mag walking through halls filled with frozen corpses and a darkness that seemed alive with a presence she didn't understand.
20 minutes until station approach,
Oakes said over the comms. Comms copy, Kelly said. Noble and Talby parroted her response for engineering and fire control. Monitoring all the ship's systems was standard operating procedure during ingress or egress from a base in case the ship had to vacate the area in a hell of a hurry. In short, there were no routine approaches or outbound flights. Everyone had to be treated as a possible threat to the crew and the ship itself. Per the captain's orders, she continued pinging the satellite array orbiting Neptune. Futile. Unlike Trident Station, the satellites produced no EMR, no signal. Their nuclear-powered cells had either been destroyed or shut down by the energy wave. Callie didn't know how that was possible, but it seemed to be the case. Callie yawned and ran another comms sweep. This would make her 10th, and it would yield the same results. The captain had asked her for the first 3 results before apparently deciding it wasn't worth his breath, and that was something of a relief. The captain had sounded a little more down each time he asked, and she gave him the answer. Nothing. She wondered if he'd stopped asking because he knew she'd tell him if the situation changed or the act of asking was too depressing.
15 minutes to arrival,
Oakes said.
15 aye,
Talby and Noble responded. Callie added her own response and leaned back in the couch. 15 minutes, and they'd be at the hangar. Another 5, and S&R Black's feeds would fill with video of the station. Black had already run several long-range analyses of the modules, but the ship had been too far away to provide much detail. Bored, Callie brought up Talby's ingress strategy. It was simple, really. If Trident's automated systems were offline, Talby and Copenhagen would provide cover in the SV-52, while Callie and her squads performed spot checks of the hangar doors and tested hull integrity. She had 4 Marines at her disposal, 2 fire teams of 2 Marines each. Since Copenhagen would be in the SV-52 with the LT, Callie would be the proverbial 5th wheel with no one to cover her. If it came to that, she'd form up with one of the fire teams. She and Talby had gone over his plans in painstaking detail. She countered every assumption he'd made, provided alternatives and contingencies, as well as a few ideas of her own. In the end, Talby had been pleased with the changes. For the first time since joining Black Company, she felt as though she belonged. Would she still belong if Gunny wasn't locked in medical stasis? Kelly doubted it. But as her Gunny had often said, don't borrow trouble. With Cartwright out of commission, the job was hers until he recovered or until Black Company replaced him. At the 5-minute mark, new windows sprang to life on her holo display. Black had activated every cam on the bow and the midships. Each was adjusted to show a different view of the station as they ate the distance. Kelly frowned at the first few images. The massive core of the station, a cylinder stretching over 5 kilometers and over 2 kilometers in diameter, reflected Neptune's light with a gentle blue glow. The 6 huge, motionless habitat rings surrounded the upper half of the cylinder, which ended in antennae, maintenance decking, and multiple sensors, including telescopes. On this side of the station, all was dark. S&R Black dipped slightly as Oakes adjusted her trim. The craft descended toward the bottom of the core. Empty mooring points covered the core's exterior, places where future habitat rings would be attached. After Mira's disappearance, all expansion plans had been scuttled some 30 years before Kali had even been born. Once the ship finished descending, the bottom of Trident Station came into view. Massive struts and clamps held the 3 S&R hangar modules as well as the 5 QM hangars in place. To Kali, they looked like misshapen fruit dangling from an ill tree. SF Gov had planned for Trident Station and Neptune shipyards to be the premier gateway to exosolar travel and industry. As such, it had been built with extreme expansion in mind, an expansion that had never come to fruition. She wished the captain had ordered Oakes to bring the ship around so they could see the other side of the station, but she knew why he didn't. They were out of fuel, or as close to it as you could get before the alarms started blaring and the captain yelled at everyone to get in their pressure suits because life support had died. Her spine vibrated with a deep chill. The idea of S&R Black going dark, of all the power dying and leaving them stranded some 2 kilometers from Trident Station, and having to jet across the Gulf, mostly unarmed, and without a redoubt, nearly froze her. She took a series of deep breaths to calm herself. It was going to be okay. Oakes would get them to the hangar. The hangar modules didn't appear to have suffered any damage, and they mostly looked normal. But the more she looked at the images, the more she knew something was wrong. She just couldn't put a mental finger on it. The hangars, she said to herself. What the hell is wrong with the hangars? 2 of the 3 S&R hangars had their outer hatches cracked open. The shadows made the cracks in the Atmos steel surface appear like sly, hateful sneers. No light spread from their interiors. That didn't sit well with her. She knew the SFN, SFMC regs for stations, and this one was a big deal. Every hatch was secured from space, or there had to be a damn good reason for it not to be. She couldn't even imagine a scenario where you would keep a hatch partially open. She imagined Captain Dunn and Black were having one hell of a conversation right now. But for the rest of them, nothing on comms, no chatter. It felt as though the ship were holding its breath. S&R Black glided past the quartermaster modules until Oakes brought the ship to a stop in front of S&R Black's hangar. The company's insignia stared at her from the bow cam feed.
Corporal,
Dunn asked.
Any EMR from the S&R hangars?
Tearing her eyes from the cam feeds, she refocused on the many sensor readings. Aye, sir, from all 3.
Type?
She shook her head, although she knew he couldn't see her. Too many to count, sir. I am picking up what could be signs of a reactor leak.
From where?
The quartermaster module, sir. I can't be more specific, but it's enough to cloud the readings.
Keep looking, Corporal. See if you can find any other signatures that look suspicious.
Aye, sir, she said.
Oakes?
Dunn said.
Get us in the barn. Aye, sir.
Oakes said. The comms went silent while everyone waited for the hangar bay door to open. A moment later, Oakes was on her private comm.
Corporal, can you confirm the signal is going out?
Aye, sir, she said. A quick diagnostic check, and yes, the ship's comms array was sending instructions to the hangar, but the hangar wasn't receiving or replying. I'm not getting anything from the automated systems, sir.
Black?
The captain asked.
Corporal Calimora is correct,
Black said.
Trident Station is not responding to comms on any frequency, including the automated systems.
Dunn muttered something before saying,
Talby, let's do it the hard way. Aye, sir.
Talby said.
Infantry, report to the cargo bay. Infantry, report to the cargo bay in full kit.
Kelly stood from the station, her eyes lingering over the seemingly frozen image of the hangar bay door. See you soon, she said to it, and headed to the cargo bay.